Hey there guys, and in this tutorial we are going to have our review. Okay, so we are going to review what we have learned. And so the first thing we talked about is the boot up process. Okay, and I'm not really going to write all of the steps, but I'm just going to actually tell you the steps in this verbal form, because if I were to write out the steps, then this review would be very long. Okay, so here's how your computer boots up. A bootloader is ran by machine's BIOS or boot firmware. The second step after that is that the bootloader finds the kernel image on disk, loads it into memory, and starts it. After that, the kernel initializes the hardware devices and its drivers. Next up, the kernel mounts the root file system. The kernel then starts a program called init, and init has process ID equal to 1, and the init then starts all of the other necessary system processes, and at some point of this entire process, you get the option to log into your system. Okay, and this is how the user space starts up. User space, and I'll write this as USS, although this isn't Star Trek, this is just user space startup. This is how it happens. First, the first step is actually init. Okay, so init is actually the process which starts the process of user space startup. And by the process of user state startup, I mean not the process in terms of operating systems, but basically just like the process of starting up the user space. Okay, init starts it. Then, essential low-level services which enable managing hardware devices and system logging are initiated. After that, network configuration takes place, so some network-related stuff happens. After that, mid and high-level services such as scheduling services and printing boot up. And then you have login prompts, graphical user interfaces, and other high-level applications. Okay, so everything starts from init. Then you have low-level services, network configuration, mid and high-level services, and then in the end you have graphical user interfaces, etc. Okay, and then when you're shutting down your computer, I'll just write this as computer shutdown. Okay, shut down. What happens is the following. Init asks every process to shut down. If some processes or a particular process doesn't respond, init initiates a kill command with the term signal. Okay, with the signal which basically says terminate. If some process or a process or multiple processes don't respond still, init initiates a kill command with a kill signal. Then the system makes preparations for a shutdown, and after those preparations are done, the system unmounts all of the other file systems other than the root file system. The system then remounts the root file system in read-only mode, meaning you can't write, only read, and then the system writes, and by the system I mean the operating system, writes out all of the data left over in the buffers to the file system. And this actually happens during the remounting process, and after that the kernel reboots or stops the system. Okay, and there we also mentioned some other things besides these conceptual steps which happen when you start up your computer, when you start up the user space, or when you shut down your computer. We also mentioned some other stuff, and we said that bootloaders are used to load the kernel into memory and start it with a set of parameters. We also said that you can have multiple different kernel images and you can have multiple different sets of kernel parameters. We talked about the message command, and the message, basically I read it as the message, but it's spelled differently, and that command is used to display kernel messages. Or you can also look at the kern.log file, which is located in your var log folder. Okay, so var and then a subdirectory of var is log. You can look there for the file name kern.log, and you can look there for kernel messages. We also said that init is the process which starts all system services, And we also talked about the shutdown command, which is used to shut down or restart your system. Okay, so basically this section was maybe a little bit more theoretical. We kind of covered a lot of these things, but I just want you to kind of gain an overview. I don't really think it's that important for you to understand all of the details, but I just really want for you to kind of gain an overview of what is happening. And more importantly, this sort of like ties up the knowledge we have gathered so far, okay? Because again, we talked about mounting, we talked about file systems, we talked about the only thing we actually didn't talk about, which I introduced conceptually, was the BIOS and other boot firmware. So basically, that's kind of like a step prior to the bootloader, and we didn't talk about the bootloader, but basically the bootloader's job is to start the kernel. But from that point on, right, so we didn't talk about BIOS or other boot firmware and the bootloader, but from that point on, then it starts with the kernel, then it starts with the init, and we didn't talk a lot about init, but init is essentially just a process, so you know all the context behind that, you know all the context behind mounting, unmounting, root file system, and you know all of these things. Okay, so I think this should really kind of round up your Linux knowledge so that you actually kind of know what is happening when your system is booting up, and if something goes wrong, where did it go wrong, right? Do you have an approximation to where the bad thing has happened? Okay. And so this is pretty much it, guys. I don't want to spend any more time on this because I think this was just kind of important to cover. I would feel bad if I didn't, but I think spending any more time on this would just not be, so to speak, best bang for our buck. Okay, so thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. And yeah, I hope you'll share this, watch this again, recommend this to friends, and like it, leave me feedback, maybe even dislike it and tell me your videos suck, but then hopefully give me a reason why they suck if that's what you think. And again, yeah, feel free to leave me feedback. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.